Now, when Project Luminous was first announced at Star Wars Celebration last year, it came with this, shall we say, interesting teaser image where they took a line from Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope, the one spoken to Luke, where he says, "The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things." And then at the end they tacked on the word "until," implying that there was some changes or redefining of the Force coming with whatever this project was going to be exactly. And since then, we've learned that it's actually going to be the High Republic era, or the time period 200 years before the prequels, when the Jedi and Republic are at the height of their power and looking to expand their influence into the Outer Rim. Which, as I've discussed in other videos, I feel is kind of an odd time period to explore because, relatively speaking, or in the grand scheme of things, it's set rather close to the time period of the prequels and the Skywalker saga on the whole, which you'd think would sort of restrict what they can do with it or the stories they can tell with it. I mean, originally I thought the idea would be to expand Star Wars, to take it somewhere else entirely, and they could have done that. They could have gone to any time and or place in the Star Wars galaxy, or they could have just relaunched the Old Republic essentially, or made what has always been canon again, and to begin telling stories in it once more. But instead of doing anything like that, they picked to go back 200 years before the prequels, meaning that with this new story, it'll have to basically align with how the story of the prequels will begin. It'll pretty much have to, I'd imagine, explain why the Jedi and Republic went from the height of their power to being on the verge of failure and defeat. Which I'm not saying can't be an interesting story, it's just an odd choice for such a large-scale project, to essentially launch a whole time period with it, or in such a small window so close to another major time period, if you will, which of course is the Skywalker saga. Anyway, here going back to that hint or implication I mentioned at the start, that our entire concept of the Force will be changed, thankfully that doesn't exactly seem to be the case, at least not from what we've learned so far. Because yeah, we did learn in the opening crawl for this project, if you will, that there's some sort of threat to the Force itself, which honestly is an idea that should have been used for the sequel trilogy, and so who knows what they'll do with that, how that might affect the lore, or change the nature of the Force possibly. But so far it turns out that what's changing is that we're going to learn that all Jedi see the Force differently, that characters like Obi-Wan or Yoda, who we heard talk a great deal about it in the original trilogy especially, saw it differently, and that everyone has their own unique connection to it. That, yeah, it's still this energy field created by all living things that binds everything together, but according to Charles Soule, one of the authors on this project, that's really just how those two individuals saw it. It's their perception of it. And that other Jedi, like Avar Kriss, who is one of the main Jedi of the High Republic era, that she sees it differently. She sees the Force as music and even calls it the Song of the Force, that to her all Jedi are like tones or instruments that can come together to make a perfect symphony or something like that. There's also a Wookiee Jedi who sees his connection to the Force being like he's one leaf on a giant tree in a massive forest. And to be fair and honest, that doesn't sound like the worst or dumbest thing I've ever heard, especially not when you consider how bad it could have been when they alluded to big changes to the Force, assuming this is about the extent of those changes. And it makes sense that to some extent different Force users would see or experience the Force differently, or even use it differently. The Night Sisters, for example, obviously interpret the Force differently and use it differently than, say, the Jedi or even the Sith. And all this even kind of reminds me of something in the real world called Synesthesia, where some people basically have one of their senses stimulated by the activation of another, like people who see numbers or letters as colors, or see colors when they hear music, or experience taste when they hear certain sounds or words, and so on. There are many different forms of it. So sure, someone seeing the Force as music, why not, I guess? And though I wouldn't say I either love or hate this idea, I am somewhat curious to see how far they're willing to go with this. I wonder if they'll have the guts to even connect this to the midichlorians somehow, which, to my knowledge, and I do try to keep up with absolutely everything, has yet to be mentioned anywhere in new Star Wars content under Disney, even though Lucas's sequel trilogy would have delved further into them, and the whole microverse with the Wills and so on. And so, yeah, I am curious about this because in The Phantom Menace and later in the Clone Wars, we learn that the midichlorians act as a sort of bridge between the living and cosmic Force, and that they even allow a Jedi to hear the will of the Force. And I've always kind of been curious how exactly that works, because I don't think it's literally whispering words or instructions to them or anything like that. I don't think that the Jedi flat out are told by the Force what to do or how to make sure things are balanced. Instead, I've always kind of assumed following the will of the Force was just sort of done by trusting your instincts, by silencing your own mind and thoughts, and just letting the Force sort of guide you, which is basically what Qui-Gon tells Anakin to do before the pod race in Episode 1, to feel instead of think, to trust his instincts. In other words, the main difference between how the Jedi and Sith operate or use the Force would be that the Jedi allow themselves to be sort of used by the Force as a type of instrument or extension of it itself to carry out its will for the betterment of all, while the Sith try to bend the Force to their own will and use it only for personal gain. This would align perfectly with what George Lucas has always said about how the basic differences between the two sides of the Force is that the light side is selfless and that the dark side is selfish. Anyway, not to get too deep into all that, I'm already going to guess that what goes wrong for the Jedi of the prequel era, why they are the way they are, as opposed to how we'll see them in the High Republic era, is that most of them will lose this personal connection to the Force for some reason, that they'll stop seeing the Force in their own unique way. And that instead of just trusting their instincts, they begin to rely on things like midichlorian tests, for example, to determine who is to be trained and so on, and they start to strictly follow the Jedi Code instead of the will of the Force itself, which maybe leads to them becoming very dogmatic, and hence they lose their connection to the Force even more, or their ability to use it, as Mace Windu mentions at one point in the prequels. Though, of course, maybe one of the problems or sad parts about all this, and the High Republic period in general, is that it would really tarnish the legacy of a character like Yoda, because he is not the Grand Master of the Council during the High Republic era. He becomes that way at some point after. And under his leadership and guidance, everything would sort of fall apart, or maybe I should say he could never again get them back on track, until of course their eventual fall in the prequels. And this is maybe my overall problem with exploring the High Republic era or giving us this story, because I used to assume that there was a very, very gradual fall for the Jedi, that over the course of 1,000 years in the absence of their arch rivals, the Sith, that they just sort of lost their way without ever having a chance to realize it, that they've almost gotten bored, and instead of just accepting the general peace in the galaxy, they try to go out there and perfect things, which will ultimately lead to their demise. And that does kind of seem like what might happen with the Jedi of the High Republic era, what with them wanting to bring peace and justice to the Outer Rim like rangers or sheriffs on the frontier, which is how they've been described. Maybe they begin to feel like just following the will of the Force is not enough, and they want to be more proactive. Either way, here we're very much being given the impression that the Jedi of this time are the best of the best, that they are the Jedi at the peak of their existence, which makes it sound like all has gone rather well up until this point, that it's not so much a gradual decline, but a pretty quick one for some reason, and that whatever happens here is going to lead to their fall and inability to turn it around before it's too late and Sidious defeats them. And speaking of Sidious, I really, really do hope and think that the Sith will be responsible for all this, that they'll be behind everything in the High Republic era, though the Jedi for some reason won't figure that out, that everything that happens will be a part of a long and carefully thought out plan, slowly coming to fruition, and anything less than that will be, for me, kind of disappointing. Which is maybe my biggest issue overall with choosing this time period. I don't know how much I'm going to care about the actual story itself, as much as I do about how this will all line up with the Skywalker saga. And instead of truly getting an original story that stands on its own in some truly different time and or place of the galaxy, it feels like we're getting another sort of prequel. And if it's not that, if it's not the Sith and their master plan behind everything, if this doesn't end up beginning to explain the fall of the Jedi, then I'm likely going to be rather disappointed and wonder why it wasn't about that. Anyway, I know I might sound like an impossible to please Star Wars fan, but this whole thing just kind of confuses me. And yes, there's every chance this could end up being a great story and that I'll love it, but I just wonder, why not go back to the Old Republic, or truly explore a unique time and place in the galaxy? And I hate to say it because I do want to be optimistic here, and Disney has got some things right on the publication front, or has put out some good books and comics, but I have to say I've got a bad feeling about this. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about the High Republic. Are you worried Disney and Lucasfilm will miss the mark yet again, or does this so far sound pretty good to you? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.